The market doesn't know what keeps you up at night. It doesn't know when you want to retire, and it doesn't know how old you are. The simple truth is, the market doesn't care. But if you care, you've tuned into the right place. You're listening to Investor Resources, bringing clarity to the confusing world of finance. Here are your hosts of Investor Resources, Don Creech and Perry Sykes.
I'm Don Creech.
And I'm Perry Sykes, and welcome to the Investor Resources Podcast. If you're enjoying these, please hit that subscribe button so you're going to get our latest releases all the time. And if you have anyone that you think might benefit from seeing these, friends, family, coworkers, anyone that may be interested in our content, forward that link along to them and give them a chance to see that. We would appreciate that a great deal.
Well, one of the things that is a narrative that happens multiple times during the year is the anticipation of what Fed Chair Powell is going to say after the next meeting. And the closer we get to the meeting, the more narratives there are about what he's likely to say or likely not to say. There's a lot of excitement and focus on Mr. Powell's comments and what the committee has decided to do at that point in time.
Man, we're boring, aren't we? Well, we that's exciting in our life. Yeah, what the Fed's going to say next. We are some boring guys, but it can be very true. The Fed actually does have bearing on what goes on after the meeting, so it is important.
Well, and the Fed wants to be boring, matter of fact, not necessarily in the past, but they certainly are now. And I would say that is a proper decision for them at this point in time. Because in retrospect, even Mr. Powell will admit that the Fed does not have a very good track record of making decisions about the economy and what should be done with interest rates.
They have been struggling for a bit, for years, in fact, and it's been a long time since after a Fed meeting, everybody's come out and said, well, thank goodness the Fed's here. They really have a handle on this. It's all lately it's been much more.
I don't remember that, Perry.
Right. What are these people doing? Why are they making these decisions? And either why are they doing nothing, or then it changed to, and why are they doing so much? It's been swinging both ways, and they're really trying. I think they're trying to get themselves back in a position of stability and a position of reliability, of doing what a little less, and not trying to be in a leadership position for moving the market or moving the economy, and which is much more a natural place for them to be.
Well, we just mentioned Chair Powell, and he's not the only one. We go back to 2018 when Janet Yellen was she was chair of the Fed. And she made some horrendous mistakes and some absolutely outrageous statements in her testimony.
Yes, she did.
In some ways, this is a problem for having academics trying to run the economy. They have lots of theory, but the real world application of how markets are going to respond, how businesses are going to respond, they do not know that. It's just theory. And theory is often wrong. I mean, one of the theories in financial markets is the modern portfolio theory, where a particular balance of asset classes is going to stabilize your return.
Correct.
Well, we know from recent activity in our own lives, even if you are in your 20s or 30s listening to this, you've been through at least one, if not two, bear markets, and probably at least had some capital exposed to it in your 401k plan, if you weren't a private individual investor.
Sure.
But for the baby boomers around, I mean, they've been through bear markets since the 70s, and actually they weren't investing typically in the 60s with 69, but there was 74, and then we had the 81, and then we had 87, and the list goes on. These happen about once every 3 to 5 years. You get a major bear market. But the academic theory says bear markets occur once every 500 years. And Janet Yellen told Congress in her testimony after the 2018 market crash, which it was down 30% in a very short period of time, And she told him, we'll never have another bear market in 500 years. She was proud and confident with that statement. That was 2018. What happened 2 years later?
Yeah.
2020.
Yeah.
Yeah, that wasn't a bear market. That was a non-event, apparently, as far as her theories
Apparently
were
so.
concerned.
Well, and that's just what you said, Don. It's like that's a pure economic academic in charge saying, well, statistically speaking, I can say this, I can speak this as truth. In reality, in real markets with real people and real money, doesn't always work that way. And she got a little ahead of herself there and forgot this is not a textbook idea. This happens. This happens in real life. And we're part of the problem. It's all the people involved. People are expected to act in a rational way, in their own best interest, in a rational manner, and people don't do that. People get confused, they get scared, and they get greedy. And when they do, they'll do things that no one ever expected, and that will drive the market in directions that no one ever saw coming. And you have to be ready to deal with those because they can become very real. And if you're on the wrong side, you can really get hurt by standing there and saying, well, this can't be happening. And it's like, yeah, it can. And it does.
Well, so Janet Yellen, given her brilliant moves as Fed chair, got promoted to be Secretary of the Treasury,
There we go.
where where she did finally, towards the end of her term, admit that she had made some mistakes.
Might have
Well,
missed a few things. Yeah.
so with Chair Powell, he was in charge during the COVID problem, and when we were on the radio instead of podcast, we talked about this a lot. He was
Sure.
making bad decisions supporting the largesse that was coming out of Congress because he was buying the treasury bills that needed to be issued in order to spend the money that Congress wanted to spend, basically throwing whatever they could at the wall to see if something would stick.
That's
Now,
what was
if you're
happening,
the
right?
recipient of that money, the free money, you didn't have to work for it. Typically, you were celebrating that.
Let's try it. Yeah.
but but now we have eggs that are outrageously priced.
Mm.
Instead of being $1.69 a dozen, I mean you can pay 8, 9, or $10 a dozen depending on where you are in the country and what kind of eggs you buy.
Yeah.
Government made some really bad decisions, and that includes the Fed. Chair Powell finally has conceded that they shouldn't have done as much underwriting and money. Technically, it's not money printing, but they create money to buy treasury bonds, and they create that money out of thin air. So
Correct.
it didn't go through a printing press, but it did go through a digital process.
It got created nonetheless. That's right. That cash got created and got dumped in the system, and that's not good for inflation. So,
Well, there is our inflation. And
yep,
basically, we've said on the podcast and in the radio before that the Fed was painting themselves into a corner. It was going to be really difficult to get out of that position. And
sure.
that's where they are now. And as
Yep.
a result, what we're seeing is inflation has subsided a bit, but the recent numbers are starting to turn back up when they're just referring to it as sticky inflation. And
Right.
hoping it will continue to come down, but instead of continuing to lower interest rates, which would spur more economic activity, they've decided to pause a while, just slow the narrative down a bit and see how things work out because inflation didn't turn out to be transitory. Another mistake by the Fed, raising expectations that those big numbers were transitory, temporary. People understand what transitory means. Is this 5% inflation is not going to last very long, but it's 9%. Well,
Right.
nine's now
Five,
unwinding.
five didn't last very long. It was on its way to nine. It's just that they didn't quite understand that yet. And that's part of the reason the Fed is looking for stability. They're trying to be more predictable right now. And at the top of their list is we don't want to be wrong again. We don't want to start cutting rates while inflation is still high. And if it goes higher, we're going to have to raise rates again. And we're really going to look like we don't know what we're doing. So they're going to go slow. Um, as Chairman Powell said himself, we are in no hurry to cut these rates, and so they want to become very predictable. They don't want anyone wondering what is it that we're going to do. So unless we see the job market get in trouble, unless we see inflation dropping precipitously, the Fed's going to go very slowly, a little bit at a time, and keep checking on the data and see if they're doing any good, or if they at least believe things are headed in the right direction, because that's the best they can do. But they're not going to try to lead anymore, and they're going to wait for things to happen, and then in essence, they're going to lead by following from the front.
Well, they do have a given with models, and the models need some sort of predictable
Right.
median number to work with. And one of the reasons, perhaps, for taking the low road as far as changes are concerned is the election of President Trump. Look at the number of decisions that have been made and the additional proposals that are on the table just in his first couple of weeks in office.
Sure.
And which one of them should the Fed rely upon as the eventual outcome? And what's the impact of the population? And will Congress do something to unwind in an executive order? If you want to build the financial model, you need some predictability. And if you have President Trump in the office with his current program, predictability is difficult to achieve. Indeed. Why build a model? Just wait for things to happen and then respond to it.
That's it, and they're going to be way ahead doing that. I think it's a brilliant strategy for right now. Let's just take a step back, stay out of the spotlight, and wait to see what develops, which is what they said they were going to do earlier, but that was before they didn't raise rates for a decade and then started raising them at record levels, record increases in the interest rate, and then found themselves way too high, having to come down some, but now, like you just pointed out, inflation being way stickier than they anticipated. And so they're painted into that corner and they're not sure what to do. And, the first rule of digging a hole, when you find yourself at the bottom, stop digging. So they're going to slow down and try to let the economy find some equilibrium before they continue on their chosen path, whatever that might be. I doubt it's going to be rate increases, but they don't want to cut too soon. So it's probably a good idea. I think it will probably work. I think, and having them a little more predictable and a little more stable, I think will help both the economy and markets move forward.
So they have three choices: don't make a change, raise rates, and lower rates. And that's where the narrative is important for Wall Street. But it's also important around the world, because the most important central bank is ours. Everybody else pays attention to what our central bank, the Federal Reserve, is doing. One place of leadership, I don't know what the Fed is doing with regard to gold acquisition, but I do know that China's central bank, the People's Bank of China, has been increasing their accumulation of gold. Their storehouse of gold for their central bank just continues to increase its inventory, and other central banks are following, which is one of the reasons why gold has hit new all-time highs this past year and is doing so this year. And the expectation is that is not going to slow down. If inflation rises, gold's kind of a weak inflation offset asset. It's really a crisis asset. It responds to crises more likely than it does inflation, because we had big inflation last year, post-COVID, and gold didn't set new all-time highs until just recently.
Later.
But as the Ukraine war and the Gaza war, all that stuff came up, gold's all of a sudden got some legs and started climbing the ladder. So that's very likely to happen. If interest rates rise because inflation's rising or the economy's expanding too fast, that detracts from gold. But if the economy's slowing and interest rates fall, then having bonds that are paying 4.5 or 5 or more in interest, that's competitive to gold and can soften the price. So the Fed's action has a lot of impact. If interest rates are stable, businesses can plan their debt service, so they can borrow money and expect to work it into a budget that's reasonable and they can survive. When the Fed is bouncing around or government policies are changing frequently, all of this uncertainty creates volatility in the investment portfolio. And that's where you really
Right.
need to understand what your investment policy decisions are. How do you make a decision rather than reacting to a narrative that you've just recently heard on a television program or a radio program or a podcast for that matter?
Sure.
If you don't understand and you don't understand the rules, or at least know who you have working on your money has rules they're following instead of the narrative, you have no idea what kind of real risk you have exposed to your portfolio. If you want information about your portfolio and like a free analysis from us, we do that. All you have to do is contact us. The email is help@iriradio.com. Subscribe to the YouTube broadcast that you're watching. And if this is of interest to you, the odds are it'd be interest to friends, family, and coworkers. We'd appreciate it if you'd pass the link on to them. Share it with your friends. Subscribe to the podcast. If you want to sign up for our monthly webinar, go to the webpage, iriradio.com. Thanks for staying with us. We'll be back again another day.